at our Metropole TVKE across all your social media platforms. My name is Elijah Charles Kiaga. Thank you very much for taking your time to start your day with us here. We are online at Metropole TV Kenya on YouTube and across Facebook as well. We are live as well on our website metropoletv.co.ke. Make sure to visit us there. All right, now the Central Bank of Kenya, CBK, retained the base lending rate at 7% for the 11th time in a row, with a new strain of the Omicron virus seemingly not factored in the latest rating. Inflation has also largely remained in the target band of 2.5 and 7.5%, with Q3 numbers from the Kenya Bureau of Statistics indicating that the economy was on the road to full recovery following the initial disruption brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. CBK indicates that credit to the private sector also grew by 7.8% year to October, compared to 7% in August, which the CBK indicated were below the ideal growth level of between 12 and 15% to support economic development. Yvonne, if you could just find us that story that was done by Vincent Odhiambo. Yes, as we look at this data here this morning, then indeed we also listening to the CBK governor giving the justification for the 7%. Then you can actually see from Jan to June 21st, that's exactly where we are in terms of that credit to the private sector. He also did outline that credit to the private sector is still below the double-digit figures where it needs to be. Let's cross over to the next data set this morning before we introduce the panel that we have for you here this morning to take you through this major headlines as well. If you look at where we are also in terms of commercial banks lending rate, you're going to see that we're stuck at about 12 point something percent. We did have it increase. Yes, we did have it increase to around 12.8%, 12.4%. That's exactly where we are, and that was as a fact of the inflation trend that we are seeing in this last quarter of this year as well. If you check where we are across the board in 2020, we did cross at 5.4%, and we're starting this month by that inflation dropping, albeit by smaller digit as well. But if we look at where we are in terms of half-year inflation trend, we're going to compare it from all the way to 2018 to 2021, then you will say 2021 numbers are on a high as well. Now, let's listen to CBK Governor Dr. Patrick Njoroge and then come introduce the panel that's joining you this morning. So we talk about that magic 7.
Kenyans could be looking at a breath of fresh air after months of high cost of living that rocked the country due to increased food and fuel prices. This comes after the overall inflation declined to 6.5% in October 2021, down from 6.9% in September, driven by low fuel prices. Fuel inflation declined to 9.6% in October from 11.1% in September. In the latest fuel review, the government offered to pay subsidies, protecting Kenyans from what could have been the highest amount for the commodity. Food inflation, on the other hand, remained elevated at 10.6% in October due to the impact of depressed rainfall on some food items.
The drivers here have generally been fuel and food prices. As you can see, non-food, non-fuel inflation has been generally stable. You can see the green in that chart, the green bars in the chart have generally been below 3%, well below 3%.
With the gradual reopening of both Kenya's and global economy, CBK insists that Kenya's inflation levels will remain within target range in the near term. Leading economic indicators point to continued recovery, with economic growth projected at 6.4% in 2021 and is expected to remain strong due to the normalization of domestic economic activities, easing of global supply chain constraints, and stronger global demand.
With the optimism that had come, we have, or let's say economic actors have, following, say, the reopening of the economy, etc. So I think these are pretty strong baseline numbers.
Imports of goods increased by 23.6% in the 10 months to October 2021 compared to a similar period in 2020, driven by an increase in imports of oil and other intermediate goods. Exports of goods, on the other hand, grew by 10.8%, with horticulture and manufactured goods rising by 19.1% and 35.3% respectively. However, tea exports declined by 6.2% due to the impact of accelerated purchase last year. The agriculture sector is, however, expected to reduce in growth.
If you've traveled around the country and seen some of the developments in terms of livestock, in the arid and semi-arid areas, and indeed also in the breadbasket, in terms of what the level of the yield, because in some areas actually the rainfall was not sufficient. So it's more of that, but you need to appreciate that last year was a bumper year. So that is really the point. So you're coming from a high base, and that is the high base of 2020. And 2020, actually, agriculture supported us dramatically.
Private sector market perception survey, CEO survey, and survey on hotels done by the MPC revealed general optimism about economic growth with improved economic activity. The prospects will, however, depend on the vaccination drive, easing of COVID-19 restrictions globally, government support on micro, small, and medium enterprises, and political stability ahead of the 2022 general elections. For Metropole TV, I'm Vincent Odhiambo.
So that is the story, and that's why we are talking about the magic 7%. That is Dr. Patrick Njoroge really going behind that area, explaining why we do have that magic 7% for the 11th time consecutively. Wow. All right, let me introduce the panel that is joining us this morning so we can actually get to talk about some and more of this as well. We do have in the studio Kennedy Echesa, who's a lawyer and educational expert. Kennedy, how are you doing, sir?
Fine, thank you.
Happy to have you around. We do have Curtis Gikara, who's an investment analyst. Curtis, good morning, sir. How are you doing?
Good morning to you, Simba. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you around as well. We do have Arnold Nkosale, who's a microfinance banker. Arnold, how are you doing, sir?
Very well, very well. Thank you for having me, Simba.
Happy to have you around as well. We are also joined by David Presena, who is a political analyst and aspirant for Member Parliament seat, Kajiado East. David, good morning, sir.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Anytime, so happy to have you around. All right, Arnold, let me begin with you this morning. It is 7% for the 11th consecutive time. Arnold, question is, have we lost the meaning of the CBR rate, if indeed we have not changed it again?
Thank you so much, Simba. We have not lost the meaning of the CBR. I think what the CBK is doing is a conscious decision which, in light of 2020 and COVID-19 and the impact it had on the economy, it's a conscious decision to maintain it at that, simply for purposes of availing cheap credit. You do realize in the event certain shifts are done on the CBR, we're likely to see the same being adjusted by banks as far as access to credit is concerned.
Yes, Arnold.
And that will definitely have a bearing.
Arnold, I'm sorry, Arnold.
On inflation.
Yes, Arnold, I'm sorry to come in at this time, isn't it? And you and I also spoke. We're just coming from a high inflation period. Yes, we've dropped in this month, fine. But then if you go back 2 months, we're talking about the highest inflation period in the country. We are off that period, fine. But then, Arnold, explain the efficacy of the CBR, if any, in the economy, if we were within the grips of the coronavirus pandemic. That's when it was set at 7%. Yes, our economy went into a contraction. We started 2021 when we already knew that 2020 we went into a bigger contraction. But then, Arnold, it has not been changed Even when we're talking about a high inflation rate, we didn't see a change. Even when we're talking about a reduced lending to the private sector, which you can see still in the single digits, it did not change. Which is why I'm asking you, Arnold, and every time we've spoken about this, I've asked you, are we losing the meaning of the CBR? If indeed we cannot bring it lower or adjust it owing to the prevailing economic conditions, Arnold?
Yeah, we are not losing it. I think the aspect of it is trying to balance essentially access to credit vis-a-vis the performance of the banks.
Yes.
So ordinarily, if you reduce further, you're simply giving the banks a shorter yardstick as far as business is concerned. So the idea to maintain it has to be to strike a balance as far as access to credit is concerned, but at the same time to have a reasonable position as far as business is concerned for financial institutions. You do realize that the contribution of banks within the economy is crucial.
Yes.
So even if banks are performing well, are performing at a reasonable position, vis-a-vis you holding the CBR at a rate whereby the banks can access affordable credit, then at the end of the day, it's just a matter of trying to establish a balance between the CBR rate vis-a-vis what is going to be absorbed by the end client or the end user of the financial services.
Yes.
So if you reduce it further, it simply means that you're giving banks a situation whereby, okay, you can reduce it further, which would have an effect whereby you can give banks more margins, but at the same time, if you do not strike a proper balance between what you're pegging on the CBR vis-a-vis what the banks are offering, vis-a-vis the market in general,
yes,
you see the market is at a point of recovery simply because of two things: injection from the IMF and also inoculation and also reopening of the economy. So all these factors have to be aligned in such a way that the financial providers are cushioned, at the same time the end users of the financial solutions are cushioned.
Yes.
So I think that's why the rate has been held at where it is for the 11th, which is a bit unusual, but if you factor in other aspects to do with balance of payments and the gradual reopening of the economy, then the feeling is that it's a fair position from where it is. If you factor in where we are at 2 months ago in terms of inflation, then it would simply mean that the CBR rate would have gone up, which would mean credit would have been more expensive, which would mean inflation would have gone up.
Yes.
So the idea to hold it up is simply to try and aid the economy towards a recovery path.
Yes, Arnold, I'll be coming back to you on that because there's a caveat to this conversation, Arnold. And that is that we are trying to unlock lending to the mass market, which indeed, again, even as the CBK was announcing this at 7%, they were still saying, well, we are below those double digits that we've been trying to target all the way since we were in the cap rate regime. Let me bring in a Curtis to the conversation. Curtis, I mean, yours has to be a bit different from what Arnold is saying. Yes, Arnold has a point. I totally get it. But where I don't understand is this magic 7. The CBK did celebrate having the hand in sort of deciding the interest rates within the economy. But it looks as if they are tied. Can you talk to me about this? What is making the CBK unwilling or unable to move away from this 7% when indeed all the factors within the economy will point that you should move if you want to?
Okay, okay, thank you. I'd like to first of all agree with Arnold because it's basically trying to get a balance between rates that would be favorable for the individuals, the private sector, and even for the banks themselves.
Yes. Because
if they were to lower the rates, they would make lending to the public, to the private sector, not attractive, and most banks would resort to channeling their funds to the government.
Yes.
And this would in turn cause a credit crunch to the general population. And this is not the situation we want.
Is that it then? Are you agreeing then that the meaning of the CBR, indeed then, it's not that important, it's not a defining tool when it comes to monetary policy within the Kenyan economy? Is that what you're saying then? Is that what Arnold and you are not trying to say?
It is. We're not trying to say that, but you see, there are a lot of factors that they usually monitor to
Yes.
decide if they are going to adjust it. And
Yes.
for the most part of the year, when they have been monitoring this, the conditions have been anchored well within the range that they have planned for.
Yes.
So there is no, there has been no motivation to adjust it in
Yes.
order to make the situation better or worse, because as it is, everything is.
Curtis, let me also come in because then
Yeah.
I don't, Arnold and you, every time we talk about this, it's as if we're closing our eyes to where we were when we're within the cap rate regime. The overall, the average commercial lending rate for the banks right now is at 12.8%. I mean, when we're in the cap rate regime, it was around 13%. Curtis, then we
Yeah.
celebrated that indeed now the CBK and the MPC have a hand in deciding what the interest rates within the country are going to be. But then, Curtis, we are still where we were within the cap rate regime. That's why I'm asking, why are we celebrating a tool that is not effective in driving the lending rates within the economy?
Okay, so you see, Simba, the interest rate cap that was instated
Yes.
in 2016, its main
Yes.
aim was to bring stability to the lending rates. Because if you look at the data before that, you'd have seen that the lending rates used to fluctuate even to highs of 18 or even 20.
Yes.
But now you see, this came in to try and bring it into a level that can be controlled. And even though it was repealed in 2019,
Yes.
if you look at the numbers, you can see that it has remained within the range that they want to. It's been at 12, 12.3, 12.5. So you see, that's still something that we can work with,
Yes.
and they wouldn't want to interfere with it by adjusting the CBR.
Yes.
So I think it was something that was well advised, and we had anticipated it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty much. But then, Curtis, just before I close back to Arnold this morning, when you look
Yes.
at lending to the private sector, I mean,
Yes.
that's even what we were crying within the corporate regime when they said, well, banks do not want to lend to the private sector because then you're curtailing their ability to price their loans. Yes, we expunged the cap rate. And now we came back and celebrated the CBR and then said, well, you see now they're going to lend to the private sector because indeed they are not they're not operating within predetermined interest rates regime. But then, Curtis, look at that. We're still stuck at asking ourselves the question, why has the CBR not helped us unlock lending to the private sector? That's why I'm asking you, is it become a useless tool?
Okay, I get your concern, but now you see, like the rates that we have at the moment, they are friendly for everyone. The
Yes.
prevailing rates. They are not too much favoring the banks or too much favoring the banks. Come up with a loan pricing model that you can justify the margins that you have.
Yes.
And that's how people can't just hike the rates as they please. So we cannot say that it is completely ineffective, but yeah, we can say that the effectiveness has reduced of the CBR, but it's still there. It's still
Yes.
there. We can't say that it's out of the picture completely.
Pretty much. Arnold, in just 1 minute, let's clear this conversation then. I mean, if you look at where we were in, if we look at where we are in the quarter three, I mean, we're coming from very good numbers of quarter three. I mean, we've been told the economy is rebounding, everything is pointing northwards as well. We don't have the Micron COVID-19 variant. The president, yes, has announced that he's not going to lock the economy or get into those tougher restrictions of trying to stop the spread of the COVID-19 in the country. Should have they factored that in? What if we didn't see the what if from the MPC as regards the Micron variant?
Okay, so you do realize there is a provision for review of the MPC every month.
Yes.
So the idea to hold it is for us to cross over to the year 2021.
Okay.
And just to mention, I think we cannot underscore the value of the CBR. I think it cuts across so many things. Number one, it cuts across interbank lending, overnight lending for banks. At the same time, it cuts across the aspect of what you're talking about, conventional credit from the banks to the consumers. I think part of the reason as to why the CBK also held it at that particular point is because of the uniqueness of the past 2 years.
Yes.
If you look at what was happening way back in 2016, there was a heavy there was a very big differential on the balance of payments, and there was a lot of pressure on the Kenya shilling.
Yes.
That's why the government at that point in time was trying to cover the position through high rates on government securities, which led to high interest rates, which led to an outcry, which led to capping of the interest rates because of the market forces at that particular point in time. However, if you look at 2019, 2020, and probably 2021, we're still adjusting and reorganizing the economy because of the effects of COVID-19, because of what kind of support we're getting from the international bodies like IMF, inoculation, reopening of the economy. And if you look at industries like transport industry, hospitality industry, they're gradually opening up. So banks will essentially be lending and be reorganizing their books as far as these trends are concerned.
Yes.
So CBR is still very relevant.
Pretty much.
Very relevant.
Pretty much. Arnold, you and I need to have a discussion on that as well. On the side, looks like majority of Kenyans, me included, need proper convincing on the efficacy of that tool as well. Let's move on to the next area as well. Now, public universities are staring at further tougher times as the funding gaps or the funding gap in the economy or to the public universities has now grown up to 27 billion shillings deficit. That's exactly what we have for you this morning as we look at this data this morning. All right, let's continue this morning so that we can look at the further details on that story as well. Now, that story on how public universities are staring at further tougher times as the funding gap for students has more than doubled in the past 2 years. Now, data from the university's fund, as the UIF, indicates that the funding gap has hit 27 billion in the current financial year, which represents a 107.7% jump from 13 billion 2 years ago. Now, the government has seen capitation for the student decline by up to 35,616 shillings per student in the period, which has further raised fears that majority of universities in the country may follow the University of Nairobi in fees to accommodate the financing gap. Now, vice chancellors have since last year been pushing the government to increase fees nearly 3 times in a bid to ease the cash flow woes bedeviling the institutions. Now, the report specifically states that universities in Kenya are in a serious financial crisis as a result of the ever-declining funding to universities from the national government, with this year's allocation only covering, now wait for it, 49.51% of the tuition cost per student compared to the required 80%. Woo! All right. Taking us into that conversation, we don't have Echesa in the studio. Echesa, that if you go back 2 years ago, that capitation per student has declined more than half. What's going on?
I think what is going on, in my opinion, is that we are experiencing very tough economic times,
yes,
and the country has to balance between funding higher education, funding basic education, and funding other sectors of the economy.
Yes.
When you make funding of higher education a priority and ensure that every time we have an increment in the number of enrollment, you increase the funds, you are likely to affect other critical areas of the economy like health and basic education.
Yes.
And remember, higher education is optional. Even though Kenyans have a right to education under Article 43, it is not mandatory like basic education. So the state is concentrating more on basic education because people are likely to enforce this right to basic education more as they are likely to enforce a right to higher education.
Yes.
And in developed countries, developed economies and democracies, universities do not rely on government entirely for funding. Universities are supposed to be self-funded through research. The Kenyan universities have been babysat for the longest period possible. We've been babysitting our universities. We are treating them like GMOs. We've not given them the capacity to do research, capacity to raise their own funds.
Yes.
Universities like Oxford, Harvard do not rely on the funding by their governments. They rely on research. When you say these COVID vaccines, these are a result of research and they sell to governments,
Yes.
and they generate money.
Yes.
In essence, universities should generate money for the government. It should
Yes.
not be the other way the other way around,
Yes.
where government is generating money for the university. Be it as it may, we are where we are.
Yes.
We are a third world struggling economy, and government must make every effort to ensure that higher education is affordable, to ensure that in the circumstances we have adequate funding that can enable Kenyans to pursue higher education without unnecessary restrictions
Yes.
of fee increment.
Pretty much. But just before I bring in David Presena to also weigh in on this issue as well, is it wrong, and I'm going to ask you now, Echesa, therefore, that we're well cognizant that we've been babysitting our universities, we've been increasing enrollment to universities over that time, and then all of a sudden, without making these universities ready for this transition that you want them to get into. In fact, let me go back to what the CS Education did tell the universities when he told them, look, we can't keep on giving you more money. You have to decide among yourselves, come up with ingenious ways so you can raise money to run your universities. That process, Echesa, is not that you wake up and then tomorrow, yes, now we moved away from the government, we have developed a system in which our research as universities enables us to fund our systems. Is it wrong to expect that within 5 years, within less than 10 years, that these public universities will be well equipped to stand by themselves financially?
I think the statement by the serious education governance experts and the CS himself,
Yes.
quite unfortunate,
Yes.
is not an abrupt. The issue of income generating activities within universities cannot be achieved overnight.
Yes.
The issue of research cannot be achieved overnight. In any event, if you win a grant, between the day of winning that grant and the day of actual funding,
Yes.
is about 2 to 3 years.
Yes.
What we need to have as a country and as a ministry are short-term measures to bridge the gap, the short-term measures to ensure that we have adequate funding. And then we need to equip our universities, have a strategic plan, a 15-year strategic plan
Yes.
of making universities self-reliant.
Yes.
We don't get up today and ask them to be self-reliant tomorrow. That is not achievable.
Pretty much, isn't it? I'll be coming back to you then, because what we do know is the majority of top universities in the country are closing their satellite campuses, just trying to look at the budget they have to push there, and that money is not there, so the only way is to close down these satellite campuses. Let me bring in David Presena this morning, who's a political analyst and aspirant member of Parliament, Kajiado East. David, the issue for public universities in the country, that the money that is supposed to go as capitation per student right now, especially in this financial year, only accounts for 49% as opposed to 80%. What next, David? David, could you unmute your mic, sir?
Thank you for having me. This is a very good debate, coming at a very good time, and this is a matter of negligence by government.
Yes.
I must say that previously the government was capping the funding per student at about 70,000
Yes.
per year. Take sort of say a course in medicine, which in a year costs about say averagely 500,000. If the government is giving a paltry 70,000 per year, so government is funding courses irrespective of the actual cost of doing the particular course, like arts, medicine, pharmacy. These are heavily costing degree programs, and government cutting it at a certain amount for all courses, irrespective of the actual cost it costs to run each degree course, is really a bad government policy.
Yes.
I think it is time that the government wake up to do its job, and because if you leave the universities to generate money or to do other extracurricular activities that generate money, I don't think it's really tenable. It's not feasible.
Yes.
Because universities are not profit-making organizations. They are there to develop knowledge, filling in the gap, and do research. So if universities are left without proper funding by government, this essentially will have a net effect of killing our university education, or producing graduates that are half-baked, demoralizing lecturers, because I am told lecturers go up to 2-3 years, part-time lecturers, before they get their salaries. And then there is also something that needs to be underscored with government, not only in university education, but all government service providers.
Yes.
Do not get to be paid in good time. Even for the capitation money or the funding by government to each individual student, they do not remit the money to the universities at the right time. So you find that money due for a particular university is paid a year later or 2 years later. So this leaves the universities in a very precarious situation, and I am sure that some universities might have to close. It is that serious. So it's about government pulling up their socks,
Yes.
and fulfilling their part of the bargain in terms of university education.
Pretty much.
It is not enough for government to fund universities for about, say, even 49%, and leaving all the other burden to the university and parents. I think it's about time the government policy on funding of students is really reviewed, and government should be able to do its part of the bargain in terms of university education.
Pretty much.
Thank you.
All right. Now, Kennedy, you hear that?
Yes.
It's not like we haven't seen some universities close. Some already have closed their satellite campuses. Case in point, University of Nairobi and Moi University are in that process, and others, should this continue, they're going to be forced to take that route. I mean, is it okay for us to sit here and say, it's fine, let them close down these satellite campuses? In fact, where are some of the students going when those satellite campuses are closed? That's one area. Number two as well, they are now proposing a new funding formula that is supposed to be used to go to these universities, including how many students actually transition, how many professors are in that, and the ability of these universities to accommodate these courses. That is what is in line now. React, Kennedy, because this is a crisis.
I think these are very good proposals by government. The problem we've also done is that we've opened up our university education to everyone.
Yes.
We've opened up university education for every teacher, for every course. And I tend to agree with the ministry. We ought to be asking ourselves, what is the impact of the courses that we are teaching to the economy? And we fund the universities based on the courses that they are teaching.
Yes.
And as we struggle with funding of the university and even increasing capitation per student, we must address the underlying factors that are pushing these universities out of market. One is the idea of mismanagement. Moi University is a perfect example of how mismanagement can bring down a university.
Yes.
Moi University is no longer a going concern. Egerton University is on its knees.
Yes.
And it is predictably, can be said, it will be closed after Moi. Then we come to other universities. There is a bit of under supervision, there is a bit of careless expenditure and looting left, right in universities.
Yes.
Secondly, why is government funding private universities alongside government-sponsored universities, public universities? We have an idea where students who qualify to go to the university are taken to Mount Kenya University, are taken to Catholic University, other universities, and government is investing in those students in those universities. They are building capacities of privately owned universities at the expense of their own public universities.
Yes.
Initially, that was a very good idea because the University of Nairobi could not take all students who wanted to take medicine.
That's true.
We used to have very high pass rates, and therefore we could ask MKU to accommodate medicine students, and government could fund them under government-sponsored programs.
Yes.
But since the coming of Matiang'i and the reduction in the cheating cases and reduction in quality grades, almost everyone who gets a C+ joins the university, meaning even public universities do not have adequate government-sponsored students.
Yes.
We need to reverse that policy directive that is compelling students who have qualified to go to the university to have an option of applying to join private universities. That money can still be spent within public universities. And I've said before, we ought to build the capacity of our universities, reduce on the number of employees. If Moi University had 40,000 students or 90,000 students in 2010, today perhaps it has 40,000 students.
Yes.
And we still have the same number of staff that we had in 2010 compared to today, which means staff is idle there. How can we reduce the cost effectiveness? And this comes about if we have good management. Government has left the universities to the management of dogs. No one bothers how the universities are managed. We even have political interference
Yes.
in terms of the management. When you get these underlying factors, coupled with the poor or reduced funding, these universities are likely to be pushed out of market.
Yes, yes. In 15 seconds, Kennedy, just before we take a short break, should they close satellite campuses or not and reconfigure?
They should not close satellite campuses because it's about accessibility of university
Yes.
education.
Yes.
If University of Nairobi has 15 students in Mumias East in Kakamega County, those students should be allowed because of the nature of their work, because perhaps of their particular disabilities,
Yes.
they may not come to main campus
Yes.
to study.
Yes.
The idea of closing satellite campuses is a bad idea. We should be striving to make them profitable to the university so that we don't close them and self-sustaining.
Pretty much. Since we are talking about them running their own affairs, should they increase fee or not? Because the University of Nairobi is doing that right now. 5 seconds if you may.
I think University of Nairobi is suffering from what we call administrative and bureaucratic arrogance.
Yes.
Institutional arrogance.
Yes.
We do not need to increase the fees the way we are doing. When we increase the fees, we are just pushing qualified Kenyans out of the sphere of university education. And we are sliding to what Professor Muigai, my good friend, used to say. He used to say blatantly that law, for example, is not meant to be taught to the sons of farmers because farmers cannot afford law. It was a very bad idea because the best lawyers in this country are sons of farmers. The sons of the rich that Gidhu was advocating for are nowhere to be seen on the national scene in terms of practice of law. So we should not strive to push the poor out of university education just because they cannot afford. Anytime you increase the fee, we have a population you are disadvantaging, a qualified population who cannot afford that fee. In fact, we should be moving towards reducing fees every academic cycle to make university education more affordable.
Pretty much. Kennedy, thank you very much for coming to Metropole Television this morning.
Welcome.
Fantastic. We take a short break. Once we come back, mobile lenders can now take us out of relief as the impending CBK regulation will not touch on interest rates. Once we come back.